Well, it's 1 minute past, so can I say good evening to everybody and call this meeting of the Bibliographical Society to order and welcome you all once again remotely. And it's so lovely to see, I can see people on screen here from outside the UK as well as far-flung parts of the UK. It's lovely to have you all with us. We will be back at the Antiquaries for our next meeting, but we are going to retain the Zoom option alongside. And I also want this evening particularly to welcome members of the Grolier Club who are joining us tonight. And to hear a lecture actually this evening from one of our newest members. So it's always, as ever, a great pleasure to have you with us. After the lecture, there will also be, as usual, a breakout room. And randomly allocated as usual, so we'll be able to meet in that way again. So do stay for that if you can. But at this point, can I just remind people to turn off your cameras if you can, please, to save bandwidth. And even more importantly, I'm sure we're all used to this by now, but even more importantly, to mute yourselves. Thank you. Can I now ask the Secretary, excuse me, can I now ask the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting of the 18th of January, 2022?
The third meeting of the 129th season took place online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 18th of January. Professor James Raven, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Dr. Edwin Rose, who delivered a paper entitled Books, Botany and Empire in 18th Century Cambridge. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: the President, Ms. Megan Gent, Ms. Bethany Kidd, and Ms. Anna Maria Rose. The President thanked Dr. Rose warmly for his paper.
Thank you very much. Can I ask members to confirm that they are a correct record of that meeting, please? Karen, are you able to see people there? Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Now, because of the current situation, with continuing restrictions until very recently, our original speaker, Professor Paul Hofteischer, cannot unfortunately be with us, and his paper, as I'm sure you've been informed, has now been postponed to a later date. So we look forward to that. But I'm delighted to welcome in his stead, and with our huge thanks for agreeing to speak to us at short notice, Dr. Justin HANISCH, coming to us online this evening. Not in the evening with you, I think, but Justin, but online from Calgary, Canada. Justin received his PhD in ecology from the University of Alberta and is currently a biologist with the government of Alberta, based in Calgary. His day job involves monitoring the impact of human activities on aquatic ecosystems, but he's also a passionate collector of pre-20th century ephemera, manuscripts, and books on the natural and social history of fish. In 2011, Justin's collection was awarded first prize in Canada's annual book collecting contest for Canadians under the age of 30. And more recently, Justin curated an exhibition of highlights from the University of Alberta's Bruce Danzig collection of books on angling and authored the exhibition's catalogue. He's also contributed articles on books and collecting to the Alcuin Society's quarterly journal, Amphora. And as he writes, he spends most of his free time thinking about and collecting books. And as I noted earlier, he was recently elected a member of the Grolier Club. This evening, he's going to talk to us about one of his favourite fish books, Louis Renard's Poissons et crayfishes crabes, de diverses couleurs et figures extraordinaires, Natural History of the Rarest Curiosities of the Seas of the Indies. A beautiful conundrum, he writes, for both natural historians and bibliographers. So it's with very great pleasure, Justin, I ask you to address our society.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks everyone for being here today. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about this book, which is certainly one of my favorites, and hopefully will be one of yours as well. Let me start my screen sharing here. Okay, you should be looking at the island of Roatan right now, and pretty soon you'll be looking at my title slide. Okay, let's see. I think I'm all set up. Yeah, as I said, thanks everyone for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you about Louis Renard's Extraordinary Fishes, Crayfish, and Crabs from my perspective as a biologist and a collector of books on fish. Now, before I get into the talk, I just wanted to acknowledge my two primary sources. The background on Louis Renard I'll be talking about today and the publication history of his poissons is from the academic work of Theodore Peach. Most of the images you'll be seeing of Renard's poissons are from the second edition in Harvard University's Ernst Mayr Library, which I obtained via the Biodiversity Heritage Library online. Other images you'll be seeing have credits embedded within. So my talk today will cover three topics. First, I'll speak about Louis Renard as publisher and the three editions of his poisson. Next, I'll discuss Renard's fishes themselves and whether or not they are fact or fiction. And finally, I'll conclude with my own experiences with a potentially unique copy of the book. So here are three of Renard's extraordinary fishes. But what have bibliographers and scientists had to say about them? Well, how about crudely drawn and barbarously colored? Inadmissible, insufficient, and often fantastic, and a phantasmagoria weirdly formed and riotously colored. So who was the man responsible for sharing this phantasmagoria with the world? Louis Renard was born in Charlemont, France, to Huguenot parents. His family fled to the Netherlands in 1685 after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Renard settled in Amsterdam and became a publisher and bookseller. Now, unfortunately, this drawing by Cornelius Truus held in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam is the only known likeness of Renard. He's depicted here smoking a pipe with Prince Eugene of Savoy in a brothel. So Renard began his career publishing small works, but moved on to more substantial books. One of his most substantial is his Atlas of Navigation and Commerce, published in 1715, 4 years before his poisson. The book is an elephant folio measuring around 22 inches by 14 inches with 28 double-page engraved plates. Here you can see the UK and the North Sea. Now, two additional editions of this book were published by the publishing house Ottens in Amsterdam in 1739 and 1745. I'll speak about this publishing house more in a little bit, as they also issued the second edition of Renard's poissons. Renard, for this book, wrote the description for the maps and designed the layout. Now, his final substantial work was his A Treasury of the Arts That Have to Do with Drawing, a work in 5 folio volumes about art and design, published between 1722 and 1725. However, after publication of his Treasury of the Arts concluded in 1725, Renard appeared to stop publishing. Indeed, his name no longer appeared in the Amsterdam trade journals. Those copper plates were auctioned off in 1738, and the remainder of his books were sold in May 1746, shortly after his death. So you may be wondering what Renard did in the 20 years between the conclusion of his publishing career and his death. Well, it turns out that for much of his life, Renard was also employed as an agent of the English crown. Indeed, this agreement was formal, and Renard did receive a yearly stipend for his work. Now, he did provide some important information to the British Crown, such as searching ships in Amsterdam for weapons. However, his work could hardly be described as secret. Indeed, he advertised his position as an agent in some of his publications. Now, Renard also had two additional occupations, one buying and selling English bonds, and also he sold medicines from a business that he inherited from his father-in-law. But of course, we're not here to talk about atlases or spies, we're here to talk about fish. In English, the title of Renard's work translates as Fishes, Crayfishes, and Crabs of Diverse Colors and Extraordinary Form that are found around the islands of the Moluccas and on the coast of southern lands. It's also known by its half title, The Natural History of the Rarest Curiosities of the Seas of the Indies. Now, Renard's book appeared in 3 editions, each issued by a different publisher. Of course, Renard himself issued the first edition in 1719. Rainier and Josu Ottens published the second edition in 1754, also in Amsterdam. And Padenburg and Holtrop published the third edition in 1782 in Amsterdam and Utrecht. Now, all 3 editions are folio volumes measuring around 17 inches by 11.5 inches. It's issued in 2 volumes, which are often found bound as one, the first volume containing 43 plates and the second volume containing 57 plates. Now, other than the prelims and index, there's really no separate text leaves in this book. All explanatory text on the 100 plates are actually engraved right on the plates. And that's one of my favorite characteristics of this book. I love how the text itself sort of winds around the anatomy of the fishes, which are present in a variety of different positions within the book. Now, the first two editions generally follow this format, but the third does not, as you'll see when I go into a bit more detail on each of the editions now. So the first edition was published in 1719 in around 100 copies. It was published in 2 volumes, sometimes found separately and sometimes found bound as one. The first volume includes a half title, an undated title page, a 2-page declaration of King George I, and a 2-page note from the editor with testimonials to the accuracy of the fishes depicted. As I mentioned, this first volume also contains 43 plates. The second volume includes the title page again in a half title, as well as the note from the editor, but without the dedication. It contains 57 plates and a 4-page index. Now, thankfully, many of Renard's letters still exist today in institutional collections and shed some light on the publication of the first edition and the distribution of some copies. Indeed, 30 copies, for example, were sent to England, 25 for sale, and 5 given to King George I. As well, several letters exist between Renard and Sir Hans Sloane. It's clear that Renard was keen to have Sloane's help in selling the books in England. Renard likely saw his market as learned individuals of considerable means and interest in both science and natural history. And Sir Hans Sloane did present the book to his colleagues at a meeting of the Royal Society of London. Now, today of that approximate 100 copies, fewer than 20 copies are extant. Now, the second edition was published in 1754. This is where I think things get a bit more interesting. Again, we're fortunate that letters are extant in institutional collections written by the publishers documenting some of the circumstances around the book's publication. Now, the publishing firm Audens actually purchased 36 uncolored copies of the first edition from Renard's estate, along with the original copper plates. Now, the Audens had intended to color and sell 30 of these copies of the first edition under their own imprint. However, Arnold Vossmeyer convinced the Audens to use the original coppers to pull and color additional copies. Now, Vossmeyer was a naturalist and curator who oversaw the cabinet of William V, Prince of Orange. He was interested in publishing himself, and he published a series of 34 pamphlets on animals kept in Prince William V's cabinet of curiosities. So for the second edition, Vossmeyer wrote a new preface, which ultimately comprised a mixed edition of plates pulled nearly 40 years earlier, plates recently pulled from the original copper plates. This edition also includes most of the preliminary material from the first edition with a modified and dated title page and a declaration from Renard. Now, this declaration is interesting. Renard actually engraved the declaration for the first edition, but for some reason he decided not to include it in all copies. In the declaration, Renard talks about the book and the source of drawings, and he actually calls his own book one of the most precious works to enrich natural history since the birth of literature. So perhaps he ended up somewhat bashful of this claim and didn't include the declaration in the first edition. Indeed, it's only extant in one copy of the first edition. More likely, though, the declaration contains a bit of a warning that some of the images in the second volume of fish potentially have been exaggerated. So it's possible that Renard second-guessed including this warning in his book, not wanting to dissuade buyers of the veracity of his book. Now, the Audens, as I mentioned, reported buying 36 uncolored copies of the first edition, but actually only 30 are mentioned as being colored. Thus, it appears that 6 copies were apparently kept in reserve by the publishers. Now, in a letter dated 6 May 1754, the publishers report that there are no longer any bound copies in stock. Now, it's unlikely that this statement about stock means the entire print run was sold. It does seem that the book was offered by the publisher neatly bound in an English cover, but it was also likely that copies were sold unbound in sheets or were colored and bound in small batches or as they are ordered. Now, when only 30 copies were planned, the price was estimated at 70 guilder. With the expanded run of 100 copies, though, it was possible to reduce the price to 50 guilder. Now, I had some trouble finding a good source to convert 18th century guilder to price today, but it's certainly a very expensive book, likely in the range of hundreds of dollars. Today, fewer than 40 copies are extant of this edition. Now, of the 3 editions, least is known about the third. It's published by Padenburg and Holtrop in Amsterdam and Utrecht, but it appears never to have been completed. It was issued without a title page, and extant copies sometimes have hand-inked title pages, like the one you see on your screen from Harvard University's copy. Now, unlike the first and second editions, the third edition includes letterpress leaves with descriptions in French and Dutch in parallel columns translated by the Dutch physician and naturalist Peter Bodert. However, it seems that this translation was only completed for the first 43 plates in the first volume of the book. Now, interestingly, and unlike the first two editions of the book, the plates and text of the third were issued in fascicles. So what you see on your screen now is the front wrapper of the second fascicle of the book containing plates 11 through 20. Note the translations were only completed for the first volume. The publishers did intend to issue all 100 copies. So as you can see from this portion of the fascicle wrapper blown up, the publishers did have the intention to issue all 100 plates. Now, the copy held by the University of Amsterdam Library, interestingly, remains uncut and in sheets as printed and includes all 4 fascicle wrappers. Now, this third edition was essentially unrecorded until 1963, although there were some rumors of its existence in bibliographies. Now, the existence was really confirmed when collector L.B. Houthaus purchased a copy from booksellers Weldon and Wesley Limited. 6 examples of the third edition have since been identified, including 2 that had been incorrectly cataloged as the second edition. However, the catalogers can be forgiven for this mistake because the copies that were misidentified, such as the example you see on your screen from the University of Utrecht's collection, have manuscript title pages that copy information from the second edition, as you can see here, including even the date from the title page of the second edition. Of course, to complicate things even a little bit more, there are copies of the third edition with all 100 plates, including 57 from the second volume. However, these plates do not have the accompanying text leaves in French and Dutch. Those from the second volume do not. Unfortunately, it's unknown why this edition was apparently never completed and why the translations themselves stopped at the first volume. So to summarize the somewhat complicated history of the 3 editions, the first edition was issued in 1719 in 100 copies by Renard. At least 36 copies remained unsold and uncolored, and fewer than 20 copies are extant today. The second edition was issued in 1754 in around 100 copies by the Ottens. It was a mix of plates from the first edition and those newly pulled, and fewer than 40 copies are extant. The third edition was issued in 1782 by Padenburg and Holtrup. It includes French and Dutch text, but only for the first 43 plates, and there are fewer than 10 copies extant. So where are copies today? Of the first edition, most known copies are in European libraries, with copies also in Australia and Japan. The National Library of France, for example, has a beautifully bound copy of the first edition. The second edition is more widely distributed, with several copies in the USA, Europe, Australia, and Japan. The copy that you see on your screen is from the British Royal Collection, and it has an interesting provenance. It was owned by John Stuart, the 3rd Earl of Bute and Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1762 to 1763. This copy was sold at Sotheby's London on May 5th, 1795 for just over £1. It was acquired for the Royal Library in 1860 by Queen Victoria. Now, the third edition is held by US and European institutions and also the State Library of New South Wales, whose copy you see on the screen now. As far as I can see, the State Library of New South Wales is the only institution that can boast to owning all 3 editions of the book. So now that we've talked a little bit about the book itself, what about the fishes and other organisms that it contains? You'll remember the quotes used to describe Renard's fishes at the start of this talk. They weren't complimentary and included words such as barbarous, fantastic, and weird. And looking at the images, I can't necessarily argue. Many do look fantastic and many do look weird. So the 460 organisms depicted across the book's 100 plates, 415 are fishes, 41 are crustaceans, 2 are stick insects, which is a bit odd as these are terrestrial organisms, and 2 are other categories. So one is a mermaid and the other is thought to be a dugong. So many of the species depicted were known from European collections at the time that Renard published his book. But if you haven't seen preserved fishes before, they're not much to look at. The preservation methods, such as alcohol or drying their skins, often result in specimens completely stripped of their original color. So many simply just look pale and white. Now, Renard knew that readers would be skeptical of his colorful fishes and provided testimonials in his book from those who painted and or provided the original drawings. So here's a page from the second edition, including testimonials from the likes of Frederick Coyette, who provided drawings to Renard, and Samuel Fleurs, the artist behind most, if not all, of the drawings. So Frederick Coyette writes, I can assure you on my honor that they were drawn and colored as truthfully as the painter and the strength of the colors could permit, although it is impossible to obtain with a brush the brightness and admirable variety of colors that these fishes have when still alive. Samuel Fleurs, the artist, says, I declare that the fishes included in this collection were drawn and painted by me from nature. This was done to my best ability, not believing that human arts can express the beauty of the colors of these fishes. Now, the original drawings were composed on Ambon Island in the Maluku Island chain of Indonesia. I wanted to show a map here to set the stage for the next few slides to come. You can see Ambon Island here with the place mark in the Maluku Island chain set within the larger context of Indonesia. So Renard likely never left Northern Europe. So how did he obtain these drawings? The Dutch East India Company had a significant presence in Indonesia, including the Maluku Islands and the island of Ambon. Colonial governors Balthazar Coyet and Adrian van der Steel commissioned drawings of native fishes during their time in India. And it was from these men or their descendants and agents that Renard obtained the drawings he used as a source for the engravings in his work. At first, a book on fish may seem like an odd penultimate major book from Renard's press. However, Renard had an interest in both travel and art as evidenced by the previous publications he issued. And as exploration expanded to the east, European collectors hungered for specimens and descriptions of the incredible animals found there. Renard likely viewed his book as an attractive publishing venture that would satisfy demand for news of animals of the East. So as I mentioned, Samuel Fleurs was the artist who created these drawings. He was a soldier in the Dutch East India Company who lived in Indonesia for around 9 years. His artistic skill was quickly noticed and attracted the patronage of collectors. Now, Fleurs actually produced many copies of his drawings for senior officials and others, and likely worked with local artists to help meet the demand. Now, although several partial sets of drawings exist today, 2 sets are the primary sources for Renard's Poisson. So a set of drawings known as the Coyet drawings held in the Niedersächsische Landesbibliothek in Hanover are the source of the engravings for Volume 1 of Renard's Poissons. Frederick Coyet brought these drawings, commissioned by his father, Balthazar, to Holland around 1708. These drawings were given as a gift by Coyet to a resident of Amsterdam who allowed Renard to copy them for Tome 1 of his book. What do these drawings look like? Here's a page from the Coyet drawings. You can see the drawing page on the left, and here's a leaf from Renard's Poissons, 2nd edition, on the right. Now, the little seahorse you see on the upper corner of the drawings was actually on the next page of Renard's book, so I brought him forward here for comparison. As you can see, there's a good deal of fidelity between the drawings in the Coyet set and the engravings in Volume 1. Indeed, the text is even the same. Now, a set of drawings known as the Sloan drawings is the source for the engravings in Volume 2 of Renard's Poisson. Renard apparently owned the drawing set he used for Volume 2 of his book and presented them to Sloan as a gift for helping to sell copies of the book back in London. This set is currently held in the Hans Sloane manuscript collection of the British Library. So here's a page from the Sloan drawings. Interestingly, the engravings in Volume 2 typically have much more text than those in Volume 1. In the drawing set, the text is in Renard's hand, but it's likely that he copied it from Fleurs' descriptions of the animals and did not compose the text himself. So if we overlay the engravings on top of the drawings, once again, you can see a great deal of fidelity between the drawings themselves and the engravings. Now, we know the sources for the drawings are known, and testimonials are included in Renard's book from the artist and officials that the engravings are true to life. How then do we end up with such weird fishes, such as this one with a sunshine on its back, this little fish with a heart on its fin, several crabs with frowny faces on their backs, and even this crab who appears to have a potted plant growing on his back? Now, in addition to some of these oddball drawings, there's also descriptions of the organisms that really strain credibility. So this fish, or this creature, which is a lobster, is actually described in the book as a mountain crayfish. And he's described thusly: lives in the mountains, dislikes snakes, climbs trees, likes to eat fruit, and lays red spotted blue eggs as large as those of a pigeon. You could imagine even a contemporary layperson reader reading this and perhaps not believing it. This little fish here is known as the Ambon running fish, and he's described as captured on the sand and kept alive for 3 days in the artist's house, following him around much like a little dog. Now, as much as I love fish, as much as I love dogs, As much as I would love to have this for my pet, it's behavior that is not true. Now, finally, these two fishes have one of my favorite descriptions in the book. They're known as the wagtail, described like this. These two fish, male and female, never leave each other. When one is caught, the other follows the fisherman and offers itself to be caught as well. If it is not caught, it throws itself upon the beach to die. Now, while this may be a romantic story for the day after Valentine's Day, again, unfortunately, it is not behavior that exists. So if we return to the quotes that I presented earlier, do you agree? Do you think Renard's fishes are fact or fiction? Well, there's another opinion that I haven't talked about yet. Indeed, these 20th century criticisms are perhaps a bit unfair, and the book was viewed as a serious work of natural history when published. The French bibliographer Jacques-Charles Brunet wrote of the book, "The illustrated plates in this work seem very much mediocre today, only because much better ones have been made since. They were nevertheless remarkable at the time of their first publication." Perhaps the most prescient review of the work came from Peter Simon Pallas in 1770. Pallas wrote of the book, and a few similar books issued at the same time, "We are taught almost daily by the arrival of new specimens that there are innumerable fish in the ocean of both East and West Indies, especially the East, that are surprising in color, form, and habits. It seems to me less and less doubtful that most of them were drawn from life, and for certain, I should dare affirm that the fishes of India become known, it will be an easy task to gradually classify and refer to species all of these histrionic and monstrous representations." Now, indeed, it seems Pallas was ahead of his time by a few hundred years. Theodore Peach determined that of 415 fishes in the book, 385 can be identified, including 251 to species, 97 to genus, and 37 to family, which is a full 93%. Of the 40 crustaceans, 34 can be identified, including 24 to species, 6 to genus, and 4 to family, for 85%. So that leaves approximately 9% of the figures that appear to be fantastical. Now, to identify the fishes, Peach describes ignoring the colors themselves, but looking at their patterns and key characteristics common to known groups of fishes, and also using a little bit of zoological intuition. So now that we know 91% of Renard's creatures can be identified, I wanted to show a few examples of the engravings next to modern photos of the species that they represent. So here's a species called Mecalar niger, also known as the black and white snapper. Certainly, you can see some similarities here between the colored engraving and the actual fish. So both the engraving and the actual specimen have spots on their back. They have this white line along their body and this band of color around the head. However, colors in Renard's bossons often have little bearing on the organism's true appearance, as if they were applied somewhat randomly or according to pigments that happened to be on hand at the time. And indeed, you can see that here, where the engraving has yellow fins, the actual specimen does not. The engraving has some red on its face, the actual specimen does not. What about the Ambon walking fish? It's an example of a figure where it was only possible to identify it confidently to a family, the family of anglerfishes or frogfishes. Now, interestingly, many of the anglerfishes have a modified fin that they use to sort of walk along the substrate. So maybe it wasn't too far off calling this the Ambon walking fish, although certainly it walked in the ocean and not on the sand. Now, what about our little fish with the heart on its fin? This fish is actually Catodon auriga, or the threadfin butterfly fish. And here's an example where if you ignore the colors, the engraving and the actual specimen seem to have a lot in common. The orientation of the lines on the body is very similar. There's a band of color across the eye on both. There's this extension to the fin that you can see on the top. And this top fin even has a spot, although in the actual specimen, it is a circle, not a heart. But here's an example where the colors of the engraving really bear very little resemblance to the colors in the actual organism. Finally, what about the crab with the potted plant on its back? It is Renina renina, also known as the frog crab. Now, unfortunately, the actual specimen does not include a plant, an image of a plant growing on its back. However, if you look, you can see there is quite a bit of similarity in the anatomy in the engraving versus the anatomy of the actual organism. So why are these embellishments included in Renard's book? It's actually somewhat hard to say. So the artist Fallours was potentially making many copies of his drawings, often for naive clientele. And this could have simply been a sales technique, bending the truth a little bit to excite some buyers. Now, it's also possible that some of his animals were painted from poorly preserved specimens brought to him, or actually painted from second or third hand descriptions. I'd like to finish off with a brief story of my personal experiences with a very interesting copy of Renard's Poisson. Now, as was mentioned, I'm an avid collector of books on fish printed before 1900, and I think this is arguably one of the most interesting and compelling fish books out there. I love the story of its publication. The engravings itself are fantastic, and it is quite scarce. But those three attributes combine to also make it a very expensive book. There's a copy for sale right now online for €150,000. So though it's a book that I'll likely never be able to afford, I do keep an eye on copies that move through the marketplace. Indeed, American Book Prices Current, last I checked, only has 7 records of public sales at auction, but that includes multiple sales of the same copy as well. So as I mentioned, I keep an eye on the auction listings for this book. So imagine my surprise when I came across a few leaves being sold at auction around 1.5 years ago. I was even more surprised to read the description that this leaf was described as having recent professional hand coloring. As far as I knew, there were no records of extant uncolored copies of Renard's Poisson. So having seen a recently, or evidence of a recently colored copy, which means there was a recently uncolored copy, I was intrigued and a bit energized and immediately sent off 2 emails, one to the leaf seller and one to the academic expert on the book. I promptly received 2 responses from the seller. Why, yes, I did break an uncolored copy. And from the expert, I've never even seen, nor have I ever heard of an uncolored copy extant of the Poisson. So I continued my investigation into this uncolored copy. Now, auction records turned up no uncolored copies, and discussions with dealers also turned up no records of uncolored copies. Although I was able to track down the dealer who sold the book to the seller who broke it, and that dealer said it was the only uncolored copy he had handled and he knew of no others. Unfortunately, he also had no information on the book's provenance. So this, of course, led me to wonder, did the seller still possess uncolored plates? After further discussion with the seller, I learned that the plates were being actively colored, but many were still remained in their original state, and that the seller was willing to sell me some of the uncolored plates prior to auction. So what did I do? I was keen to preserve as much of this book as possible in its original and potentially unique state. Indeed, the engravings themselves, absent of their color, could provide additional clues to the identities of the fishes depicted, as the colors applied were so often inaccurate. So in the end, I was able to purchase 24 uncolored plates from the seller before they were colored, or around 25% of the plates in their original state. 1 non-plate text leaf from the book, the half title page for the 2nd volume. I ended up purchasing 3 recently colored examples, and the book's previous binding, which unfortunately was recent vellum, but with a contemporary Morocco spine label. So here is what's left of the book. You can see one of the uncolored engravings on the top. Here's the half title page peeking out. Here's one of the stick insects in a recently colored example. And the binding is open on the table there behind everything else. So what am I going to do with this now? Well, I'm going to be happy I preserved at least some of a potentially unique state of an important book. And I'm also planning to create a memorial book of sorts to what was. That will involve putting my pages back into their binding in order and interleaved with blank pages for every missing page. I'm also then planning to bind in an essay I started on the book's provenance, its importance, and a little bit of editorializing on what is lost when books are broken. Now, for posterity, I have also saved images of all the recently hand-colored plates. Eventually, these will hit the market again, but there's nothing on the plates to indicate that their coloring is recent. Thus, I thought it was important to save digital copies of each of these recently hand-colored plates. I also thought it was interesting to compare the recent hand coloring to the same plates from the 1754 second edition. I have a subset of images from the seller of the plates, both before and after their coloring, which I will show you here, compared to the same plate from the second edition with contemporary coloring. Now, I'll have to ask your forgiveness on some of these pixelated plates, because unfortunately, it was the highest resolution that I received from the seller. So of course, what you see on the left here is the uncolored plate. Here is the plate with recent hand coloring. And here is a scan of the same plate from the 1754 second edition. Now, on first glance, it looks like there's quite a bit of similarities between the contemporary and recent hand coloring. But if we zoom in on two of the fish in particular, some of the differences will become evident. So here's the recent hand coloring. Pay attention to the tail fins of the two fishes. If we look at the contemporary hand coloring, you can see that there's definitely some differences in how the color has been applied. There's also some overall differences in the shading. So again, we have the recent hand coloring and the contemporary hand coloring. You can see that in the fishes on the bottom, the fish's bottom fin, again, there's some differences in how the color is applied. Here's a plate with several more fish. So here's the recent hand coloring, and here's the contemporary hand coloring. Now I'll zoom in again. Pay attention to the little pink fish in the upper left-hand corner. So in the recent hand coloring, here's this little pink fish. In the contemporary hand coloring, you can see that many of the little engraved dots have been colored in. So contemporary, recent without the little dots colored in. Again, you can see some overall differences in the shading and how the colors have been applied. Now, I still think there is potentially a little bit of research that can be done on this book. I noticed on one of my uncolored plates what looked to be a little bit of spilled ink or perhaps some damage to the printing plate, as you can hopefully see here. Now, I will be zooming in on this, so even if you can't see it very well, hopefully you will on the next slide. Now, of course, I wondered if this potential damage was unique to my copy or if it might be damage to the copper plate itself, visible in other copies. Well, I found an almost identical pattern on a scanned copy of the same plate from Harvard's copy of the second edition. And here I'll zoom in a bit, so hopefully you can see this better. So as you can see here, two copies of the second edition, my uncolored partial copy on the left, and that in Harvard's collection on the right, have what appear to be the same errant ink mark on the plate. Now, what about the third edition? If this was damage to the printing plate itself, I would expect to see the same damage on plates from the third edition. And indeed, that damage can be seen, however, faintly. Now, in at least two copies of the first edition that I have examined digitally, however, this damage appears to be absent. As far as I know, it's not known which copies of the second edition includes plates pulled or plates from the first pulling in 1719, and which include plates from the second pulling of 1754. Thus, I'd like to view this plate in all extant copies of the book, and if the damage is absent from all copies of the first edition, it's potential evidence that the damage occurred sometime between the completion of the first edition and before or during the printing of the second. Of course, with only a relatively small number of copies from all editions in existence today, this investigation can only provide partial and inconclusive evidence of when this damage may have occurred. However, if a copy of the first edition is found with the errant ink, then we'll at least know that the damage occurred to the plate during the printing, likely during the printing of the first edition. This also might help me shed a little bit of light on the origin of my uncolored copy. Could this be one of the 6 copies of the first edition reserved by the publishers of the second? Or could this be a second pulling that somehow escaped coloring by the publishers? It did, after all, include a title page of the second edition. Although I'll likely never know the origin of my uncolored copy, I look forward to investigating copies of this plate to learn more about when the damage may have occurred and what clues that might give to when copies of the plates were pulled. Let's see here. Now, I'm going to conclude with something a little bit different here. To my knowledge, Renard's Poisson is the only fish book to have experienced a bit of a renaissance in popular culture. What you see on your screen is a YouTube music video from the British musician Cosmo Sheldrake. Sheldrake's 2018 album, The Much Much How How and I, made extensive use of Renard's Poissons on its album art and also in animated music videos. I'm going to play about a minute of this music video for you to see how Sheldrake made use of Renard's Poissons. I just have to make sure my computer audio is sharing here, which I believe it is, and I'm going to play this. Hopefully you're hearing sound now.
you come? Did you toddle or run? Did you skip, jump or stumble? Sing along, put some pickles on, and play the mellotron.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little musical interlude. As you can imagine, I was quite excited to see the intersection of 18th century natural history and 21st century orchestral pop. Let's see. And finally, you may or may not be surprised to learn that there is even merchandise available featuring several fishes from Renard's book. I, of course, have purchased this shirt, and I'm wearing it right now as I deliver this talk. So that's about all I have to say about Renard's Psalms. If you're interested to learn more, I can recommend some additional reading, including the journal articles in the first 2 bullet points and the fine facsimile and commentary in the final bullet produced by Dr. Peach. And with that, I'd be happy to stop my screen sharing and ask any questions if anyone has them.
Justin, thank you so much. Really, absolutely fascinating, taking us from that first edition in Amsterdam through the 3 editions and then ending with those with that extraordinary story at the end. Thank you so much.